every human being needs at least three things: meaning, belonging, and a sense of purpose. And each of those has its deepest answer in faith.
Welcome back to Conversations. I'm Emma.
And I'm Ginny. Today we talk with Dr. Os Guinness, a well known author and Christian apologist, and someone I'm blessed to call a friend.
Oz encourages us to ask life's big questions, such as why am I here? What is my purpose?
Let's talk with Oz.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Real privilege to be with you.
Oz, I first met you years ago when you were speaking at a conference and then had the privilege of working with you at the Trinity Forum. Even for the first time I met you, I was just struck by your passion to invite people on a spiritual journey to find out what life's about or why we're here. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I always love sharing my faith because you know that every human being needs at least three things: meaning, belonging, and a sense of purpose. And each of those has its deepest answer in faith. You know, you look at the, say, teenagers in America today with the rising suicides and things like that, and people have said it's a mental health crisis. And I think that's rubbish. It's actually a crisis of meaning and a crisis of faith because there's so much confusion. And so I'm one of those who loves inviting people to think through what it means to come to faith. You know, I love Socrates saying the unexamined life is not worth living. So people have to think about it. But I'm passionate to try to help people who really want to know the meaning of life.
When Jenny was kind of telling me about you, the first response I had was very similar to what you just shared. There's probably a lot of people, and you mentioned suicide and I mentioned depression, people who are struggling who could see you as somebody who could really help them in that time with your work. So what kind of started you into taking something that you're passionate about and writing these books? I guess tell me your story. I don't know the full story.
Well, certainly my story is behind it. My first 10 years were in China, and I was born the year of Pearl Harbor. We lived in north central China where my parents were medical missionaries, and we had the Japanese army on one side. They'd killed 17 million in the invasion. And then we had the communists above us and the nationalists, the so-called Free China, on the other side. To stop the Japanese, the Chinese flooded the dikes of the Yellow River and killed 900,000 of their people overnight without telling them. In other words, life was cheap. We were in a terrible famine in which 5 million died in 3 months, including my two brothers. I nearly died. My mother nearly died. And when my parents took me, I was only very small then, 4, we joined a river of refugees, 10 million on the road. And then we moved later to Nanjing, which is the capital of Free China, so-called. And I was there when the revolution reached its climax. And I'll never forget the day my dad said to me, "Son, we're in trouble. Chiang Kai-shek has abandoned the city, and we're at the mercy of the Red Army." And in they came. And for 2 years, we were under arrest, and the reign of terror began. So my first 10 years were a kind of crash course in realism about life. And unless you had a solid faith, how could you see yourself through those times? But a very critical time for me was I was a student at London University. This is the early 60s. Drugs, sex, rock and roll, the counterculture, Fellini films, Bergman films, free speech movement, you name it. If you didn't have a faith, you had to really think back to square one about everything. And I remember coming over here a few years later in 68. And I met Mario Savio, who led the free speech movement. I was at Berkeley, Harvard, various places. And clearly in the 60s, you had to know what you believed. And that sense of meaning, belonging, and purpose was critical. So the challenges of my own life make it very personal to me. And it's a joy to reach out to others who are searching today.
It seems like in the 60s, it was common to have the kind of meaning of life discussions. You talked about your experiences at L'Abri, for example. Do you see a resurgence of that with the younger generation really wanting to be or being open or verbal about their search?
In a little way, but nothing like the 60s. I mean, I lived then in Switzerland, and down the bottom of the road, about the mountain, there was a crossroads on the way to the east. It was always 5 or 6 hitchhikers. You could hitchhike freely in those days. They'd be sitting there waiting for a lift, and they'd be reading books, and one would be reading Nietzsche, and one would be reading Siddhartha, one might be reading C.S. Lewis, and sort of, hey, man, you got to read this and think about that. It was fascinating. People wrestling, debating, arguing, protesting. Then came 1970, in the early 70s, the me decade, and it all faded. Hitchhiking, of course, is dangerous today. So the younger generation, yes, there's a return. I'm very grateful because, as I said, there's a real confusion about faith. And many have claimed you don't need faith, which is absolute rubbish. And so that search for meaning and belonging is starting all over again.
Your story kind of started at such a young age of 4, if not earlier. What brought you to be so strong in your faith? Is there a specific story or realization that you can share with us? Or were you just fortunate to have your mom with you who had a strong faith? Or what does that look like?
In terms of my own life, my parents were eventually allowed to send me home to England, and I went to English boarding school. So my teenage years, I didn't have my parents. So probably growing up, I didn't think much about faith. It was just natural to my family. Never thought about it myself. But when I was back in England without my parents, I realized I had to think it through for myself. And for me, it was probably 2 years or more of a search. And I was fascinated with Nietzsche and Sartre, and my hero when I was a teenager was Albert Camus. They were all on the atheist side. And then on the Christian side, because I wasn't particularly interested in, say, Buddhism and Hinduism. I'd grown up in that, and I wasn't attracted to that at all. And I read Pascal, whom I love, and G.K. Chesterton, and of course C.S. Lewis. And at the end of about 2 years, I was finally convinced the Christian faith was true. Absolutely true. But it was only when I went to London University, and you had the exploding 60s all around, that it was tested. You had to think through everything back to square one. I had to know why I believed, and what I believed, and why I believed, and so on. And so the 60s were a very important time for me in cementing and confirming and deepening my faith and seeing how you share it with others. Because at L'Abri that Ginny mentioned, we had passionate seekers of all sorts, people going out to ashrams or going to live and work in Israeli kibbutzim and so on. And you had conversations that went up to 2, 3 in the morning and started at breakfast and went on all day. It was a fascinating time. And sadly, a lot of that disappeared. But that was the world in which I thought through my faith.
I love that. I wish there were more of that today. Do you find, as in talking about searching, that you've mentioned that we have so much to live with today, material goods, that we don't always have much to live for? Do you find that people naturally have a search, or that sometimes it's a trigger point, a crisis that starts them on that?
Well, I thought through what it is for a person to move along the journey to faith. And there's no question that the first phase is always when questions strike in. Before that, you drift along. Many are complacent, or they believe what their parents believed, or what their friends around them are believing at university, or whatever. They don't think much themselves. But when questions strike in, and they do so in all sorts of ways, sometimes it's a health crisis. Sometimes it's an intellectual question. I'm very enthusiastic about what my great mentor, Peter Berger, calls signals of transcendence, experiences that break into people's lives and raise questions they're simply unable to answer to that point. And so they become searchers, seekers. And that's the key stage when you move from just taking everything for granted to really asking the question, what is the meaning of life? And that's actually the stage that a lot of people haven't reached, and they need to be prodded and prompted and triggered to reach, to start thinking.
A huge topic that we like to focus on in our podcast is purpose. I am interested because I have not had the privilege to read your books. I'm just finding out about them. Can you tell me a little bit about the purpose that you find for yourself in these books? Of course, we're going to share them with our listeners. What are they about, and what is the hope for people reading them? And
for you writing them?
Well, purpose is a very interesting example of people searching because there are obviously a lot of options on the table. I used to talk to the great philosopher Dallas Willard, and he was the one who first showed me that while there are, if you think about it, 1,001 possible answers in the room, there are actually only three big families of faiths. Families of faith in the sense they have a common family resemblance because they go back to the same root idea. And if you think of it that way, there are three. There are the Eastern family, which is Hinduism, the oldest, Buddhism, the Reform movement, in California, the New Age movements, and so on. And they all go back to an impersonal ground of being. And then you have the secularist family, atheists, agnostics, materialists, physicalists, and they go back ultimately to chance. And then you have in the West the biblical family, above all Judaism and the Christian faith. And you begin with an infinite but personal God. Now, when you take an issue like purpose, they play out very differently. So the East says, put it in two words, forget it. When you take yourself seriously and find purpose for yourself, you're caught in the world of illusion. And you've got to get out from that world of illusion and go back through yoga or whatever form you choose to be like the river flowing into the sea, like salt merging with water. You lose your individuality and become one with the ground of being. Forget it, purpose. Now, you look at our atheist friends, they're the opposite. Do it yourself. I had seminars from Bertrand Russell when I was a student. And if you've ever read him, he always had the picture of the Greek giant Atlas who carried his own world on his own shoulders. Do it yourself. There's no meaning or purpose out there to be discovered. If you want to do it, it's up to you. And whatever you decide, that's it. Jewish and Christian view, the biblical view, is so much wonderfully different. What is purpose? Finding the purpose of your life and fulfilling it as our Creator made us to be. And that's a wonderfully different one, the whole notion of calling, becoming whom God knows you can be. So it's not only be who you are, but become whom you can be. It's the richest, deepest view of purpose there is. So you can see there, searching is partly a comparative process. That's actually stage 2 of the search. Stage 1, a time for questions. Stage 2, a time for answers, but the answers are comparative. Which one answers the questions best? And that's a very important stage in the search too.
What would you say, Oz, to someone listening who believes in meaning and purpose, but they're looking within themselves? That seems to be a cultural moment of, who am I? What's my identity? I'm going to find purpose by discovering that in and of myself.
Well, that is the atheist position. Do it yourself. And of course, it's led to all sorts of wild ideas that you can just choose to be in. Unless you authentically choose, you're not really free. And now you can choose. You are women. You can choose to be a man. Now I'm a man, can choose to be a woman. And you go on down the line. And you can see that it leads to identity crisis and often to the extremes, to addictions and to madness. We can't choose to be whatever we like. Partly that's an American myth. You can be whoever you want to be. There's enormous freedom in the American dream and prosperity, but you can't be whoever you want to be. I couldn't, for the life of me, be a linebacker. I'm simply not built to be a linebacker. If you go on down the line, it's far more restful to discover God's purpose so that we become whom He knows we've been created to be and we can be fulfilled to be. And the idea we can just choose just leads people astray.
Is there a way that we as individuals can help people understand their purpose, their meaning, life's meaning with people who are just curious, who may not already have faith or understand it?
People who are, quote, just curious, Emma, they tend to dabble and they're sort of dilettantes playing around in the pool. But searchers, seekers are serious. They have a question, they want an answer. I covered the second stage, the look for the answers, comparative. The third stage is a very important one. It's all very well to say, yes, here's an answer that looks meaningful, looks attractive, but the question is it true? And that's a stage a lot of people just skip out. And the third stage is a time for evidences. And usually people are convinced of the truth in one of two ways. Either they see that the Christian faith fits in a big picture way. G.K. Chesterton was like that. When he was at college, he was obsessed with the brokenness of the world. But as he began to think about it, as he put it, he was stopped in his tracks by a dandelion. What did he mean? There was brokenness, ruin, evil, abuse, rape, murder in the world. But he looked at the humble dandelion, beauty. And our world is filled with brokenness and beauty. And so his search, he said, what explains both? And there's nothing like the Bible for explaining both. Creation and why beauty, the fall and the ruin that comes in. And when he suddenly saw that the biblical picture fitted, it was like sort of Archimedes crying out, Eureka! And his prose, if you read his story, it gets incredibly exciting because everything started to fit in a big picture way. Someone very different from that was C.S. Lewis. He looked at the details of faith in a close-up way. A friend of his who's an atheist told him, well, Jack, you should look at Jesus. And he was a literary critic. He'd never read the Gospels. And he read them, and he thought, well, people tell me, Jesus, great teacher, magnificent ideals. He said, there's much more. Yes, he's an incredible teacher, but he also says things, Jesus says things, which, if not true, are mad. And he said, you've got to choose. Now you've got to work out, is he a legend? Is Jesus a liar? Is he a lunatic? Or is he, as he said, Lord? And for Lewis, it was looking at the details in a close-up way, and he was finally convinced, and he didn't like it. He thought God would interfere in his life. And he said, I was the most reluctant convert in England. But it was the evidence, the truth, that brought him to his knees. Now, that's the third stage. The fourth stage is a very critical one, a time for commitments. No, it's not just assent to these truths at arm's length, but making a commitment of your whole life to God. And that's where it starts to become real and where people are not dabbling. And it goes beyond curiosity, as you put it.
I love those stages. When I was in college, I asked a friend, why are you a believer if you had to boil it down? And he said, because Christianity makes the most sense of the world as we experience it, which is what you're saying, the brokenness and the beauty, death and life, right? Can you go into that a little bit about death, evil, suffering? You've said even that can be a pointer to people, to God and to faith.
Well, I have the story in another book, Signals of Transcendence, of W.H. Auden. And if any of you know his story, he was a brilliant young poet, but he was an atheist, and he fought against Franco in the Spanish Civil War and came over to New York to try and escape all that was beginning to happen at the beginning of World War II. One weekend, and there was no television in those days, so if you wanted to see anything, you went to your local cinema to watch the Pathé documentary. He didn't realize that the audience he was going to was largely German in Upper East Side, New York. So he went to watch, and he saw a documentary on the Siege of Poland, 1939. Nazi stormtroopers bayoneting women and children. And the German audience were on the side of their own Germans. And they cried out in the darkness, kill them, kill them. And Auden watched it horrified. He said, till then, he'd never thought humans were evil. He said, now I saw evil, and it must be in my heart too. But then what really shook him, I had to say, he said, that this was absolutely evil. But he knew, as an intellectual, there are no absolutes. It's only old fogies who believe in absolutes. But he was confronted with the fact that he had to say it wasn't relatively evil or culturally evil or evil if you were British and not German or evil if you were whatever. No, it was absolutely evil. And so Auden said, I left the cinema a seeker after an unconditional absolute and met Jesus. In other words, the horror of evil and the fact that he had to judge it led him to the grounds where he could judge it. Absolutely.
I heard that you also hosted a documentary called Truth Rising. Is that correct?
Well, I didn't host it, but I was interviewed in it.
Interviewed
It's
in.
actually
Okay.
sponsored by Focus on the Family, who kindly and generously put it out free. So people can go truthrising.com and get the link and watch it. There are two halves to it. Where are we now? And how do we respond? What do we do? And I was asked to be interviewed along with some others, Neil Ferguson, the great historian, and so on, in terms of where are we now? And then the second half is on various people responding in the middle of their lives as to what you do about it. So it's an interesting documentary. See what you think.
For sure. What else would you, if you were to give our listeners a challenge, like let's say they're seekers, let's say, what challenge would you give them to just begin moving into the other stages?
Well, I challenge people today to think, we tend to think of the search as purely personal, and it is. We've each got to make up our own minds as to what's the meaning of life and so on. But if you think, these things are very practical on every level today. So America's in crisis. You take the 250th anniversary, take the Declaration, the famous second paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Now, how could Jefferson write, we hold these truths to be self-evident? Americans all nod happily. They were not self-evident, say, to the Greeks. To Plato, Aristotle, would have been ridiculous that humans were created equal. To Hindus, it would have been ridiculous. Some are born Brahmins, and some are Dalits and untouchables. Why is that self-evident? It's self-evident to readers of the Bible, because people are created in the image of God, but not to most people. Or you take freedom. Have you ever thought that atheists do not ground freedom? All the great atheists, Marx, Freud, and many others, are determinists. If we can look at all the chemical, economic, and other factors that influence us, we can't do otherwise than we do. Freedom is an illusion, Sam Harris says. There is no ground for freedom in atheism. Where does it come from? Jewish and Christian ideas from the Bible. In other words, these things are not just important for us as individuals. They're very, very important for our societies. And if we want freedom and justice and human dignity, we've got to understand where they're grounded. And once again, they're grounded in the gospel, in the Bible.
You know, it seems like the younger generation, Gen Z, my daughter is, there's a lot of talk about empathy and understanding people's stories and where they've come from. But it leads to, therefore, everybody should be able to make any choice that they want to, for example. So where's the middle ground there? Because I feel like they are on the right road in a sense, seeing the image of God in every person and wanting to validate that person. But like you said, in a sense, there's no grounds to their anti-racism, anti-bigotry kind of passion.
Well, you've answered your own question. Their impulses, their intuitions, their first responses are right. Many people are passionate about justice today, but unthinkingly, they go the way of cultural Marxism, which is a disaster down the long run in terms of justice. So thank God for their impulses, their intuitions, their first responses. We've got to press them. What's the ground of what you're saying? And if you have an alternative to the biblical view, where do you think it leads? And many of them lead to disastrous ends. C.S. Lewis used to say, follow an idea out to the absolute ruddy end. A very English way of putting it. Francis Schaeffer used to say, push people to the logic of their assumptions. You look at, say, Elijah on Mount Carmel. He's one man against 850 prophets on the other side, and the royal court against him, and the people sitting on the fence. He doesn't say, come back to God. He says, if Baal is God, follow Baal. And he challenges them to see if Baal can come through. And he can't. That's what we've got to do. If people are into crazy things or relatively good things, but without any basis, we've got to gently and lovingly say to them, because what they're trusting will be inadequate in the long run. Press it out. See where it leads to. There's a better way.
You've given us a lot to think about. Do you have a next project that you are moving towards?
Well, I've just published the second of a quartet of books on the Western crisis. The first is Our Civilizational Moment, which looks at the West as a whole. The one that came out last week is called America Agonistes, in terms of the 250th anniversary. The third one is on the American crisis too, and the fourth one will be a Christian response. But now that I'm in my 80s, I realize if you wait for the normal publishing time, it would take too long and I wouldn't be around even to see them. So I'm publishing, self-publishing on Amazon. And so
Great.
the last one, for example, the first one, it took 1 week. I handed it in, and 1 week, I got the book back. Last week, it took 2 hours and 1 day, and I got the book back in
Sounds
my hands.
amazing.
That was incredible. The current one's called America Agonistes.
Well, we will put links for all that and the documentary that you're in our show notes. It's been such a privilege to have you, and hopefully we can have you again sometime.
Well, thank you. My privilege to be with you.
I hope our listeners really take the time when they're listening to this podcast because there's so much good information. So
Listen to it a couple times.
yeah, you could study it. You could pause it and take notes. But thank you again and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe so you don't miss the next episode.
Tell others about the podcast.
And for more information on today's guest, check out our show notes.
Until next time.